Good evening, everybody. Indeed it is. My name is Joe Kuiper. I'm director of the Virginia Museum of Natural History, and welcome to the Wayne Theater. Oh, okay. All right, we got a little ruckus going on in the back there. I think they're settling down. All right, so again, I'm Joe Kuiper, director of the Virginia Museum of Natural History. Welcome to the Wayne Theater, and speaking of the theater, I want to thank them so much. I don't remember how many years we've been doing this lecture series now. It's been since at least, I believe, 2017 that we started doing lectures on miscellaneous topics pertaining to the natural history of this part of Virginia. And we've also then have begun to thematically, we made themes of our lectures to match our exhibit experiences and so forth. And tonight we're going to have a good talk. It's going to be a great talk from the standpoint that we're going to hear from one of the people who's going to be deeply involved in the upcoming exhibit design process for our VMNH Waynesboro campus. Now, I am happy to say that I used to call it the proposed VMNH Waynesboro campus. It is no longer proposed. We are in the pipeline. So if you hadn't heard, we got the funds from the state to do the last phase of actual design work. So we're right now, yep. And good on all of you for all the support. We've got to thank the city of Waynesboro and everything that the elected officials and the city workers have done. The Waynesboro Advocacy Committee, which represents members of our Board of Trustees, community supporters and so forth, and also the Center for Cold Waters Restoration, a nonprofit economic development group that looks to utilize freshwater resources in an economic development sense. And so they've been instrumental in this, and you're going to see in the relatively near future that many of our exhibit themes will fall along with freshwater resources, particularly as they are right here in this part of Virginia. So, hey, speaking of which, this is such a cool place. We're so glad that we picked Waynesboro with its proximity to National Park, Skyline Drive, Blue Ridge Parkway, and the Appalachian Trail. We've got great infrastructure right nearby. There's so many reasons to say yes to putting a branch of our museum here. But even cooler was Mrs. Northam, our governor's wife, was here today with the Department of Wildlife Resources, and she was busy observing and assisting with a high school project where they were inserting freshwater mussels as part of a rehabilitation process of the river, and they were doing the actual hands-on work right here in Waynesboro. In fact, next month's talk is going to be by Brian Watson, who is an aquatic resource biologist for DWR, and he is technically the state's malacologist, or the person that is in charge of freshwater mussels, or some people call them clams. One of the most just diverse and beautiful groups of animals that you can find in our precious fresh waters. And he's going to present an update of the mussel restoration in the South River. So, with that, let me just kind of real quick give you a timeline of where we're going with our design process. We are right now in the process of receiving and evaluating proposals from architecture and exhibit design firms. That takes a little bit of time. We are a state agency. We got a lot of hoops to jump over, but we'll be hard at work here, hopefully before the calendar year ends, and we're going to have new designs to show you, updated designs. We finished our first planning process in 2019. That kind of is your first crack at it. We're going to go back and we're going to do a deeper dive into the design, both of the building and the experiences on the inside of the building. And don't forget, too, we're going to be right next to the South River Preserve and everything that's going on there. And so we're working closely with Waynesboro Parks and Recreation, because we're going to try to do our best to make sure the experiences in the building and as you exit the building into the South River Preserve and the Greenway is feeling just like one experience. So we're really excited. But without further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Carol Nash is an associate professor in the School of Integrated Sciences at James Madison University. She's also a research associate with the aforementioned Virginia Museum of Natural History. And not only that, but about 2 years ago, she joined our Board of Trustees. So she has been instrumental in helping guide the strategy and direction of the museum in recent years here. Carol's quite the busy person, as so many faculty are, and I'm just really impressed with the various projects that she's been involved in, and she's going to be covering some of that tonight. But I also want to mention that she's director of the Environmental Archaeology Lab at JMU and founder of Mountain Valley Archaeology, which is a nonprofit that promotes citizen science. So we're not just talking opportunities for graduate students and colleagues who've already been through school to work in the field of archaeology, but this gives citizens a chance to engage as well. In 2018, she actually gave a talk here at the Wayne Theater on the story of Native American communities in a changing Shenandoah Valley environment. And so tonight's talk is kind of a follow-up to that, in which she'll be talking about the Crossroads, archaeology, natural history, and the South River Watershed. So without further ado, please welcome our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Carol Nash.
Thank you, everyone, and I really appreciate being here. It's great to see you. Shout out to the Massanutten chapter of the Archaeological Society of Virginia, which is having its meeting tonight somewhere online watching this. A few of our members are here this evening. I really was heartened to hear Joe's description of the way that things are going for the campus. We used to refer to it as the satellite, but I think it's coming into its own. I certainly part of the Virginia Museum of Natural History. But as I was thinking about the presentation tonight, it occurred to me that the talks I've given here before have been pretty general. They have focused on the broad area. And this gave me the opportunity to really delve into a different part of archaeology, and that is the archaeology of the South River watershed, just staying focused in the South River watershed. And I have to say, I found some things in doing this research and preparing for tonight that really kind of surprised me. And Joe, there is yet another reason why it's good that you all picked this place, and I'll explain why that is in just a moment. So as we get started this evening, I certainly could come and talk to you all about historic archaeology. There's no question that there is really important work being done on sites that date in this area from the early to mid 18th century forward. But tonight the focus is going to be on Native American sites in the valley, in the South River watershed. So here we go. I do want to begin tonight by acknowledging that we are meeting on the lands of the indigenous Monacan, Manahoac, and Page culture communities, and these are both historic Native peoples as well as cultures that are known archaeologically, and we are not really sure what happened to them, where they are, but where they ended up. And that in itself is a very interesting story. But we also want to acknowledge, of course, that their ancestors were here for hundreds of generations. And when you're in a place as beautiful as this, when you're coming tonight and seeing the Blue Ridge with the cloud bank sitting on top, what was that all about, right? Wasn't that amazing? You really do begin to think more about these deeper issues, and so that's what we're going to do tonight. I do want to remind you that one of the subtitles of the talk is Crossroads, and the idea behind that is we happen to live in this place that is almost in the center of the great Appalachian Valley. And of course, what that means is we are in the center of this valley that extends from Canada all the way down to northern Alabama. And as many of you know from traveling in other parts of the world, valleys are interesting places. But if you've lived in the Shenandoah Valley all your lives, you know from the history as well as our current communities that this is a place that brings together people from different cultures. Historically, it always has. So as I tell my students, if we were standing on the corner of the street in Harrisonburg in the 1740s, we would have heard West African dialects. We would have heard Native American languages, possibly Shawnee. We would have heard High English. We would have heard Low German. And I think it's pretty interesting that today, for example, in Harrisonburg, that there are 50 different languages spoken in the high school. It is one of the resettlement, Harrisonburg is one of the resettlement areas for the State Department because of the Mennonite community, the support that is there. And I often tell people that it may look extreme today when you're looking at those numbers, but historically, the valley has always been a place where people have moved through and interacted with each other and created really unique communities. And that goes far back in time. So we keep in mind that location, but tonight, we're going to focus a little closer to home on the South River watershed. And I have to say that it is pretty fun to be able to focus on the lowlands because for so much of my career I have been up in the Blue Ridge and looking at archaeological sites. And you don't separate the uplands and the lowlands, but the fact is there's a different story down here. And I think sometimes we surprise ourselves when we delve into this and realize just the uniqueness and the differences that do exist that we can pick up as we look at these places. So there is your South River watershed that's outlined, identified by the U.S. Geologic Survey, and of course extending from west of Stewart's Draft all the way up through Waynesboro, Cremora, Dooms, all those hot spots, Grottos, Port Republic, and ends at that wonderful place where the South River, the North River, and the Middle River come together to form the South Fork of the Shenandoah. I always quiz my students about this. I'm thinking, okay, we're starting with the lower watershed. Where does it go? So today the question was, what happens to the Shenandoah once it flows and where does it meet the Potomac? And most of these kids are from Northern Virginia, so you would think they would know it's Harper's Ferry. You'd think they would know this. They don't know this. So I'm on a mission to make sure that my students are looking at maps. I think maps are very important. So you will see a lot of maps tonight. Okay. But I want to also identify for you why I've chosen watershed as one of the framing concepts for the talk tonight. Of course, watersheds that's a very old term. It goes way back. If you actually look at the etymology, the meaning of that word, where it came from, the origin, it goes back to Old English, and it literally means shedding. It means shedding, and the notion is the divide between water systems and their drainage basins. And so you start with the highest point, and you look at where everything drains to and where it flows out of, and you identify a watershed that way. So the reason that we are looking at watersheds tonight is because they have had a lot to do. Those boundaries that today we see on maps have actually had a lot to do with how people settled in this valley, and indeed it had everything to do with where we find Native American sites and why we find them as we do. But I do want to point out there's another reason why the South River is a crossroads. And we know that the pointer does not work on this screen, so if you see me going over like this, I should have brought my yardstick, right? That's what I'm doing, but you'll see I have UR here. So look at how close the South River is to the watershed divide with the James River. Right there, right there. So this place, the South River, is the southernmost watershed within the Shenandoah-Potomac Basin. And that means something. That means something. That's a really important piece of information, because what that means more than anything else is that the Native people who were here were broadly interacting with folks across the mountain. Even though they called this place home and were focused here, they had networks. They had networks that took them into the James River Basin, took them up the valley, through the into the Potomac Basin, and in some instances even over into West Virginia, in the Potomac Basin in the South Branch over in Pendleton County. So when we tell these stories, geography is very, very important. It becomes very basic to understanding what we're finding and why we are finding it. And bringing it closer to home, of course, our North River, the Middle River, and the South River, as you can see on the slide, watersheds, very important for framing the human environment story. That's what we're after tonight, the human environment story. Human settlement is often focused within watersheds. If you look at the early patent maps, the early maps of European settlers in the valley, for example, you will find that it's rare for a group of people who showed up here together to cut across watersheds. It's very common for them to have purchased land and live within the same watershed. That had a lot of meaning. So what are we going to do with this information? Well, there's one other piece of information that is very important about the South River. We've already said the South River is unique because it is the southernmost watershed in the Shenandoah drainage, but it's also unique because the Blue Ridge pinches in here. The Blue Ridge is only one ridge wide at this point. It is the narrowest at this point at the South River than in any other place in Virginia. Okay, it skirts out as you get south of here, the Blue Ridge skirts out, but it's this narrow little ridge where that point, where the arrow is pointing to, but then it opens up into the widest part of the Shenandoah Valley. So if you actually measure as the crow flies, and of course I say that and my students have no idea what that means, but as the crow flies, where the mountain is its narrowest point, it opens up to the west to the broadest section of the Shenandoah Valley. And so that's a really interesting point, and that had a lot to do with the number of archaeological sites that we know about in this area, as well as the different cultures that are represented. We also want to mention that makes this a crossroads as well. So this is one of those places. This is one of those happening places that we want to acknowledge. Another thing to keep in mind, of course, is it's not a huge watershed. South River is not a huge watershed. It's 234 square miles. It's big enough. But the elevations within this watershed are semi-dramatic, depending upon where you're from. Colorado, probably not too impressed. But going from 3,250 feet, Trefoot Mountain, all the way down to 1,050 feet at Port Republic, that's some pretty significant relief. And ecologists will tell you that that is enough relief to talk about something called vertical zonation, which means that as you move up in elevation, you begin to see different ecological communities. And it's compressed. It's compressed in this place. So that's something that we keep in mind as well. As I say, compressed crazy geology, one of the characteristics of this area. There are also a few other really interesting things about this valley, about the South River watershed. For example, Back Creek. Now, I got to know Back Creek really well because of our work at Wintergreen and traveling down the road, going up the back way to Wintergreen. But Back Creek really is a valley within a valley, and there are not that many of those around here, and so there are interesting stories associated with Back Creek as well. So I hope you get the idea that in doing this kind of work, you become deeply enmeshed in place. You become deeply enmeshed in the characteristics of the places where you live, and you begin to recognize things that you didn't really think of, you may have taken for granted, but they're actually quite important. The other thing we want to mention is there are some really, really interesting landforms within the South River basin. So, for example, Big Levels. And Big Levels is known to people who hunt. There are a lot of folks around here who go up to Big Levels to go deer hunting, for example. It's in George Washington and Jefferson National Forest, but it's this really, really interesting plateau. It's one of the westernmost extensions of the Blue Ridge. It's almost like an arm of the Blue Ridge. It's coming out into the valley at Big Levels. These flat mountain summits with natural pools, natural ponds, and vernal pools. It's a very unique location. It's been studied to a certain extent. There have been a number of ecologists who have worked up there and some archaeologists, but it's a very interesting place as far as that goes. But the thing that, Joe, this is the thing that I really hope we will focus on as we tell the story of this place. There are more wetland ponds and sinkhole ponds and wetland prairies in the South River watershed than in any other documented location in the state of Virginia. These are really interesting features. They are old features, you will see in just a moment. But on the left-hand side there, you see a map from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and these are the wetlands. These are the areas that have been designated as wetlands from Stewart's Draft down to Lyndhurst, so you're getting over toward Maple Flats. And as I look at all of this, it was putting these maps together and just thinking about this, how incredible that you all can drive about 15 or 20 minutes and you are in the middle of this really, really unique place that no other place in Virginia shares. So we want to keep in mind that this actually had a lot to do with Native American settlement. We've got many questions, but we're starting to put together a picture of these. The sinkhole ponds are these shallow depressions. They contain standing water for usually part of the year, unless there is a drought like this year. I think some of them really dried up this year. They're found in the western base of the Blue Ridge, and you will see them like we showed you on that map, but more importantly, there are more of them here, but they're old. They have actually been cored. Sediments have been taken from them, and organics in those sediments have been radiocarbon dated. They date to the end of the Ice Age. They date to the end of the Ice Age, yeah. So there are some really interesting questions to be answered about how they formed. There are different hypotheses about how you get 30 of these at Maple Flats. What is going on? It has a lot to do with the fact that there is a perched water table. It looks like there was a tremendous amount of erosion off of the Blue Ridge during the Ice Age, and that ultimately it covered up this water table and it began to percolate. And it's really pretty interesting to read the geologic literature as much as I can understand it. You know, it's not my thing, but I try hard. But anyway, the thing that really stuck out to me is the age of these, because as we look at some of the examples, so here's the Calbane Prairie Natural Reserve, Natural Area Preserve. Again, wet prairies, mesic prairies, calcareous spring marshes, nothing else like it, but it's here. It's in the South River watershed, and that's pretty cool. What we want to mention is that the earliest recorded archaeological sites in Augusta County are around these ponds. The earliest recorded, and this takes us back to the first people. This takes us back to the people that archaeologists refer to as the Paleo-Indian people who were here at the end of the Ice Age. We have known for a long time that sinkholes were particularly appealing to Native people. A lot of discussion as to why that was. Of course, you know, what we now see as a sinkhole when they were here several thousand years ago could have been still an active spring. And so that would make a lot of sense. But the interesting thing about these sinkhole ponds is that the Paleo-Indian early archaic sites that are 15, 14, 13,000 years old are around these. And so what I'm thinking is they must have been fairly stable landforms and fairly stable resource areas for the first people who came. And that's one of the reasons why these sites are located around them. But just as an example, looking over at the Maple Flats area and a little bit beyond towards Stewart's Draft with Quarles Pond and Hack Spring Pond, it's been over 60 years since these have actually, over 50 years since these have actually been studied. So it would be great to go back because we know a lot more now than we did then. But coring down into the pond and pulling up those sediments and just very, very carefully teasing out the pollen, which is, I've talked to you all about this before, the pollen doesn't disappear. The pollen stays in the soil for 70,000 years. And it is very specific to the plant that it comes from. And so if you can tease it out, you know something about vegetation history, and that tells you something about climate. And so over at Hack Pond and Quarles Pond, these sorts of studies were done in the late 1960s, and it was found what you would absolutely expect. At the bottom of the pond, dating to 13,000 years ago, a pine spruce forest that was transitioning to oak and hazel. So that's the end of the Pleistocene, coming out of the cold and starting to move into the warm. Then coming up through that column, closer to us in time, the transition to oak hickory is seen. And you'll see that that's 9,500 years ago. So, you know, a little less than 4,000 years, and there is a completely different forest on this landscape. And then, of course, getting closer even to us in time, after 5,500 years ago, the oak pine forest, that's closer to what we would expect to see today. So one of the reasons I love to talk about pollen is I like saying palynology. But I also really enjoy the fact that it is this window into a past climate and a past vegetation history, but it also helps us understand how the environment responds. And one of the things that we have learned is very, very clear from studying these pollen sequences here in the valley, and that is there are many instances of climate change, but the change was very gradual. The change was thousands of years. It was not the kind of change that we are seeing today. Nothing like what we're seeing today is showing up in the pollen record, you know, going back, and we're able to go back in some parts of the Blue Ridge almost 70,000 years. And the changes that we are beginning to document today are not part of that record. And so I think, to me, what that says is just how relevant archaeology and how relevant these past studies are to give us the kind of context that we need to understand these processes and to make decisions going forward. But coming back into this South River, we've talked about this as a geographic crossroads. We've talked about it as a natural wonder. So how does archaeology fit into this South River puzzle? We've kind of hinted at it a little bit, but we're going to get into it now. So the one thing to keep in mind as we go forward this evening is just to remember that Native people being here in the valley for 15,000 years, we're talking 500 generations of people in this place. 500 generations of people in this place. And for roughly 13,000 of those years, based on archaeological evidence, we know that the lifeway that they followed was that of the hunter-gatherer. They were hunters and gatherers in this incredibly rich, unique place. And there were not a lot of them. It's very difficult to estimate population, but the interesting thing is we can absolutely find their sites and see just where they were and have an idea of what they were doing. And that is a real gift in doing this kind of work. So as a reminder, for those of you who haven't studied hunter-gatherers in a while, we're talking about very small-scale societies, so multiple families living together. You would see multiple generations generations, but cousins, aunts, and uncles, more than likely, groups of no more than 20 to 30 people throughout most of their time here in the Shenandoah Valley. And kinship was very basic to the way that they interacted with each other. And, you know, this is the pattern that is seen all over the world. One of the things I tell my students is, we would not be here had our ancestors not been hunter-gatherers. People in our past were hunter-gatherers. It may be 20,000, 30,000 years ago, but in our past, there were people who knew how to get along on the land and whose families had been in these places for that long. And I find that to be pretty fascinating. But when we think about how they made a living, we're talking about hunting, fishing, wild plants, but also a worldview that's based in sharing. And we see this again and again in the archaeological record. We can trace it through artifacts. We can trace it through the movement of raw material and the movement of spear points and pottery. And you can absolutely see groups of people who are bringing together their different styles of pottery and creating a new style. And one can only imagine that you're looking at a marriage that took place between two different groups and different ways of making pottery being brought in together. But also, and this is the thing that sometimes is very tricky to understand, mobility. These are people who moved. So these are not folks who were settled in one place year-round. These were people who early on, at the end of the Ice Age, were actually moving very widely, possibly 200 miles a year back and forth. But as we move closer into the warmer period, the Holocene era that we are living in, mobility was very patterned between the lowlands and the uplands and back down again, in different sized groups, engaging in different activities along the rivers, but also up in the mountains. But then also a cosmology, a way of looking at the world and a belief about the way the world works and how you are connected to things that are much greater than yourself, that really joins together the physical world and the spiritual world. And so talking about this, this is just kind of the pattern that shows you that seasonal movement in the uplands, from the lowlands to the uplands and back down again, pattern that is seen all over this area. We have beautiful archaeological sites in the high elevation Blue Ridge, but they're not permanent sites. People were going up there, gathering nuts perhaps, hunting, but then coming back down and living along the rivers. That was an old, old pattern. Very old. But in the valley itself, thinking about getting back down into the valley, around 2,000 years ago, so remember 13,000 years of this focus on hunting and gathering wild resources, around 2,000 years ago, Native people in this area began living in small villages or on the levees of the rivers. And then by about AD 1400, so only a little over 600 years ago, they were living in these towns. They were living in these large palisaded towns. They were practicing maize agriculture, and they were living not right on the river, but on the terraces above the river. That's where those sites are found. And some of you who have heard me speak before, I go through the whole history of Native people here. It's quite extensive and absolutely amazing. And tonight we're not going to do that. We're going to kind of take off on some of the points that we've made already, because what I'd like to do is get us to think for a moment about what we mean when we say natural history. We talk about the Virginia Museum of Natural History. We talk about these beautiful sinkhole ponds that I've showed you pictures of, and the natural world, the pristine natural world. But really, you all, this is a very strange way of looking at our planet, to be quite honest with you. If you look at the etymology of the term nature, of the word nature, it does not come to mean something beyond us, something that is apart from us, until the mid-19th century. Until the mid-19th century, the Industrial Revolution. That's what did it. It was the Industrial Revolution that really severed that long-standing relationship between culture and what we now call nature. It's hard for us to even find the words to talk about it because we're so used to breaking that down and dividing it. And yet, when you look at indigenous systems of knowledge, and of course more and more scientists are paying attention to these, they're recognizing that Native people actually do know a lot, that they have embedded a lot of really important information in their oral traditions in particular. But in indigenous societies, there is this notion of humans as just one part of something that, again, is much greater. And so the notion of dividing nature from culture is anathema. It doesn't make sense. And across the world, in most indigenous languages, there is no break like that. There is no break like that. So the question is, what do we do with that information? Yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day, and one of the things that I was thinking about as I was preparing the talk for tonight is, what does it mean that I can give you this presentation where we lay out all of these interesting facts about the South River, and we kind of layer the Native people on top of that? What would it be like if we had been here for 500 generations? How would we look at this place differently? How would we think of ourselves differently? So just to give you an example, a few years ago, some of you have probably had the opportunity to visit the Native American National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. If you haven't, I hope you will go. It is really quite an amazing place. But prior to that facility being built, the Native exhibits were in the Museum of Natural History. So you would go past the big elephant when you walked into the rotunda, and you would go look for the Native exhibits, because the idea was Native people were more of nature. They were not people like we are, but they were more of nature. And now that the museum, the National Museum of the American Indian, has been constructed, you go there, it is the story of the environment and Native people. The two are not severed. And so as we have been having our discussions about what the exhibits are going to look like here at the satellite campus of the Virginia Museum of Natural History, we have the opportunity to bring those things back together again. And those kinds of interpretations where you bring together human history, environment interaction, and environmental change are really powerful stories, and they are waiting to be told for our area. So I'm going to end with two stories that I think bring together culture and nature, just as a way to an example of the work that we're doing. The first one is called Foraging for Rocks, and the second one is called Agriculture in Downtown Waynesboro. Okay, so here we go. First of all, Foraging for Rocks. And this was prompted by a lot of work up in the Blue Ridge, both in Shenandoah National Park as well as at Wintergreen. But in doing work up there, we began to realize that archaeologists had overlooked large Native American sites that were acres in size, well over 3,500 feet in elevation, something that you would not expect to have seen at all. And really, they weren't well documented because most archaeologists thought that everything important was happening down in the lowlands, right? And so as we began to do our work at Wintergreen and in the park, we just were finding Native American sites everywhere. In the Wintergreen Basin, so far, we've documented 70 sites, and some of them are well over 10 acres in size, okay? Now, keep in mind, the Wintergreen Basin is up here. That one ridge is right there. You come down into the Back Creek Valley and you're in the South River drainage, okay? So there is definitely a relationship, a topographic relationship there. So lots and lots and lots of evidence of Native people. But those of you who are from here and have been up on Skyline Drive, or maybe you have been on the Blue Ridge Parkway, have no doubt seen this. This happens to be just Brown Mountain in Rockingham County, close to Browns Gap. But these are outcrops of Antietam Quartzite. It's the Antietam Formation, and it is that beautiful white quartzite, and it just comes off, it sheds off of that mountain. It sheds off of the Blue Ridge, all up and down, from Lexington going all the way up into Maryland. So it's one of the formations that really does shape the Blue Ridge as we know it today. And when we say quartzite, think sandstone, but it's undergone metamorphosis, and it's really tough. It's a tough rock. It's a hard rock. That doesn't make a lot of sense, but it is a hard rock. But quartzite was moved by native people in great quantity during the period from about 10,000 all the way forward to 500 years ago. It was a rock that was desired by native people. They went to a lot of trouble to get it, to carry it with them, to move it around, and it is found all through the Shenandoah Valley. It is found eastward across the Blue Ridge. It doesn't so much make its way into West Virginia as much, but we happen to be in an area where when you look at artifact collections, 90% of them will be made of this material. So it's quite common. But this is an example of what we see. These are artifacts. These are flakes from making stone tools that have been on the ground surface. They're probably 4,000 or 5,000 years old. You just walk on top of them when you are up there in people's backyards next to the golf course. That's where they are. But what we found in doing our work up there is that native people were carrying this rock with them because this is not found there. But they were carrying pounds and pounds and pounds of it up there. So it's not like they were picking up the rocks down below, making their spear points, and then going off and hunting up above. They were carrying rock with them. And so we began to ask, what is that all about? We weren't quite sure exactly what was going on. It sure didn't make sense. It didn't fall in line with our models, which said that you make your spear points at the quarry sites down below, and then you take off and do what you need to do. This is a very different thing that we are seeing. And again, you will just walk around and you will see artifacts everywhere. It's very difficult in some places in that basin to put your foot down without seeing artifacts. So pretty remarkable. But the other thing to keep in mind is that this formation, as we said, is found all up and down the west side of the Blue Ridge, and yet, what we find are lots of these beautiful spear points that are made out of this material. But this is what it looks like. This, when you're walking up on when you walk up on Brown's Mountain, this is called talus. And it's hard to get to this stuff, okay? And once you get to it, it can be of very poor quality. And so we were not finding quarry sites on the mountains. So the question is, where were these people getting their quartzite and taking the trouble to bring it all the way up to the top of the Blue Ridge? Where is this stuff coming from, and what were they up to? Because very clearly, they were not messing around with this stuff. This is the stuff that you see from a distance, and you can see the stripes of white on the mountains. That's what this is, okay? What we found is that they were working cobbles. They were working cobbles. They were working cobbles down below in the South River District, in our particular region that we're talking about tonight. And that actually is a core of rock that weighs almost 20 pounds. And I'm thinking, what child misbehaved and had to carry that up the side of the mountain? But, you know, the interesting thing is we see this now at Wintergreen, but we also see this in Shenandoah National Park, where there are big mountain basins. We see this pattern. And it's pretty fascinating. It's completely changed the way we think about Native people and their movement as well as their activities. But we do find, of course, the entire, what we call the reduction sequence. So again, not leaving this rock at the quarry, but bringing it with them and then working it up on top of the mountain and leaving behind these little pieces that they were not going to use, but what we call debitage, the debris for making stone tools. It's everywhere up there. So as I mentioned just now, we do see this at Big Meadows. We see this in multiple locations in the Blue Ridge, but we have studied it most intensively here. And in doing this work, we've figured out a few things. So first of all, in looking at, looking at an aerial photo, a satellite image, what you're seeing is Back Creek. Back Creek is full of the most beautiful quartzite cobbles you could imagine. So just rocks, round rocks that have been tumbled in the stream and have a cortex on the outside. They have what's called a rind on the outside. That's a cobble. Yeah, thank you. But Back Creek is just full of these beautiful cobbles. And your Pryor's Camp is the archaeological site where we were finding all of this material. It's an archaeological site that's 10 acres along the 7th hole of the golf course, okay? But along the headwaters of Laurel Spring. But these are the cobble beds. And this is actually Cole's Run. So if you go over into George Washington National Forest, you will see these incredible cobble beds. And you will also find that the material is just gorgeous, right? It's beautiful material. You flake it, it's sharp, it holds an edge. But what we've come to realize is that the native people were very smart. They weren't going to mess with that stuff on the talus slope where there was a lot of impurity and it was hard to get to. They let gravity and time do the work. And by the time the cobbles get down to the river, they're the toughest ones, they're the sharp, they're the ones that are the hardest, they're the ones that are the best for making stone tools. And so that appears to have been part of their pattern in the South River in the South River watershed for a long time. Archaeologically, what we are seeing is that big levels seems to have been ground zero for this, and particularly the streams coming off of big levels and going down toward, well, for example, you can see Maple Flat Pond over here on the right-hand side, but definitely the Shenandoah area is prime time for this kind of activity. The boxes that I have marked here are, inside of them are probably, each one of them, 30 or 40 archaeological sites that have been documented. Just camp after camp after camp of these people sitting there, getting these cobbles, doing their thing, but then leaving, and then going up to the mountain. And we've never seen this kind of intense activity anywhere else. We find the big sites in Shenandoah, but we've never seen the source material and the source activity like we have in the South River Basin. And I am thinking that it has a lot to do with that one ridge, and the fact that it's not that difficult to move between. So we used GIS, we used Geographic Information Systems, and there's this really cool little tool that's part of GIS. You can place yourself on the landscape and say, I need to go here, what's the path of least resistance? And it will map a path for you, right? So we ground truthed this. We ran the system, we ran the GIS model, and the GIS model said, walk this way if you're going to go from the cobble beds up to the sites at Wintergreen. And indeed, what we found as we walked that were archaeological sites all along the way leading us directly to Pryor's Camp. And so, again, this story of mobility, this story of Native people making their way in this area and knowing things about this place that were absolutely important to their success here. All right, story number 2 is agriculture in downtown Waynesboro. The first archaeological site that was ever mentioned in literature for the Shenandoah Valley was in Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, on the state of Virginia. And he had different chapters, and chapter 10 was about what he called Aborigines. And many of you are aware of the fact that he was involved in the excavation of a burial mound on the Rivanna River on property, a farm that the Jefferson family, his father owned, Peter Jefferson owned, on the way into Charlottesville. So on 29, as you are passing over the North Fork of the Rivanna River, there was a very large village and burial mound there that was home to the Monacan people. It was the documented historic village of Montesukapana. But the thing is, after he did that work, he was pretty curious about where there might be other sites. And so he notes in, this was published, I think, in 1781, in the low grounds of the south branch of Shenandoah, where it is crossed by the road leading from the Rockfish Gap to Stanton, there is another barrow, and that means a burial mound. That means a burial mound. So we will talk for just a moment about what those are, but I want to follow with what he's saying here. Both of these, the one that he excavated as well as the one over here, within these dozen years, just in the last 12 years, have been cleared of their trees and put under cultivation because they're located on the floodplains where the agricultural soils are situated. And so the farmers, the Europeans who came here, saw them more as an impediment and not recognizing them for what they were. And so he says, even within 12 years, they've been reduced in their height, spread in width by the plow, and will probably disappear in time. In 1833, Samuel Kercheval wrote that they had disappeared. So within just 2 or 3 generations, these magnificent archaeological sites, one of which was here in downtown Waynesboro, are gone. And when we talk about burial mounds, what we are talking about are these features that are above ground cemeteries. And this is a photograph from 1965, the Lewis Creek Mound on Indian Mound Road. So if you trot a little bit to the outside of town here and are on, it's called Indian Mound Road for a reason. And this was what was left of the Lewis Creek Mound in 1965, and that was again excavated. But what remained of the mound was estimated to be about 50 feet in diameter and only about 2 feet tall. But local people had been digging into it since the 1920s, and by the 1960s there had actually been 5 projects where local folks had taken artifacts from this particular mound. This is what these things would have looked like, though. So how large were they? And we call them accretional because they accrete or grow by level over time. And the way it worked is the mounds themselves were catchments for villages in particular region. We think probably 6 or 7 square miles. So all the villages within 6 or 7 square miles. When a person died, they were buried in place, but at a given time, everyone who had died during that period was exhumed and brought together to this mound and buried in a level, and then covered over with soil. And then maybe another 10 years, the same thing again and again and again and again. And so the estimates are the smallest ones were 40 feet in diameter. The largest ones, the Linville Mound, for example, in Rockingham County, probably 80 feet in diameter, from 5 to 15 feet high. And the burial populations, again, it's hard to estimate, but between 1,000 and 2,000 people buried in these mounds. Yeah. I am working with the Monacan Nation to try to locate what it remains of these sites. And we've been working with some landowners in Rockingham and Page County. And it's pretty interesting because attitudes have definitely changed. It used to be that you would sometimes walk up to these folks and want to talk to them about setting aside that little portion of their field so that the cows don't get in it. And we try to keep the groundhogs out and everything, and don't want to hear it. But that's changing, thankfully. And so we're having some success in documenting what remains of these mounds. We're using non-invasive techniques. We're using LiDAR imaging. I'll show you some of that in just a moment. Satellite imagery and so forth. We're not excavating into them. But anyway, there was an early chapter of the Archaeological Society of Virginia here in Waynesboro, the Southern Shenandoah Valley chapter, very, very active in the 1960s and 70s. And a lot of the members were folks who worked at DuPont. They were engineers, they were folks who were trained in science, and they got really excited about archaeology. One of them was John Huffer, and he donated his collection, just an extensive collection, to the Waynesboro Heritage Foundation and museums, and you can go there and ask to see it. It's just boxes after boxes, but the reason that particular collection is so important is that he kept meticulous notes, so that we know where those artifacts are from. We're able to put together the story of the artifacts with the particular location and know something about how this complex story fits together. One of the other parts of this, though, is we just want you to come home. When we talk about the South River District, now we're bringing you to downtown Waynesboro, and you'll see that I've circled an area that is probably pretty familiar to you, but this is what that area looks like without any of the roads, without any of the houses. This is called LiDAR, and it is a type of imaging that literally removes all vegetation. I can explain, if you really want to know, I can explain to you how it works. But the notion is you actually get an image of the ground surface without anything overhead getting in the way of your seeing it. And so what I want to point out to you are a couple of things, and I am going to step away from the mic for just a moment, if you'll bear with me. So you'll notice this is Rockfish Run, and it looks like a pretty natural stream until it gets to about here, and you can see that it's been channelized. You can see how straight it is right there. So it's been channelized. And then you've got Steel Run, which still has a lot of its natural sinuosity, its natural curvature to it. But what I want you to look at are these huge, there's the Winona School, these huge floodplains, the big floodplains of the Shenandoah River. And I want you to imagine that those big floodplains of the South Fork, not the Shenandoah, but of the South River, excuse me, that there were villages that were like this. That this was downtown Waynesboro 500 years ago. Pretty much right where you are, within spitting distance of where you are. That would have been the story of this place. So many things that we can see with this technology that have just opened doors to the way that we understand how landscape and culture fit together. But we also want to bring this to your attention. One of the members of the Archaeological Society of Virginia, who was very, very active in this area, in the 1960s, he was an engineer at DuPont, and so he would walk the park, he would walk, the floodplain, and it was well known to local collectors that there were big sites down there. So a lot of the huge collections that are from this area were made on those floodplains. And archaeological sites that are 10,000 years old all the way up to the last native people who would have lived in communities here before the Europeans arrived. So those are very important places down there. But he found this. He found this object, and it's only 32 millimeters in diameter, so it's not that large. It's made out of this beautiful dark green steatite or soapstone. And as the description in the article that reported it says, in a spoil heap of ditch dug for laying a water line in a city park in Waynesboro, Virginia, area formerly known as an Indian site, a favorite spot for relic hunting years. No part of the site now remains. So we keep hearing that story. No part of the site remains. This is an effigy face. And there are only about 12 of them known from Virginia, and there are 2 from Augusta County. We don't quite know what to make of them. There is a lot of discussion as to what exactly they mean, but we do know that they date to the time of the settled villages and agricultural practice, maize agriculture. And there are some archaeologists who believe that this represents an ancestral guardian spirit, that it was part of a planting ritual, that it was worn by someone in the community who was in charge of planting. There are others who have argued that it looks like an Iroquois false face mask. Some of you may be familiar with those. But the thing that is fascinating about all 12 of these is that the mouth is open in all of them. And in indigenous society, open mouth means life. Open mouth means the breath of life. And so as you look at this incredible, incredible object, we begin to put together this story, just get a glimpse of the complexity of the societies who were living just down from where we are right now. So, to go back to this, there are only 8 archaeological sites recorded for the city of Waynesboro with the Department of Historic Resources. We know there are a lot more here, but they've just not been recorded well. And so, most of those are historic sites. The Rife Loath Dam is recorded. The Walnut Grove over on Pratt Run is recorded, but there are hardly any Native American sites, and there are none recorded for Constitution Park area down toward DuPont. Nothing is recorded from down there. We have notes from some of the members of the chapter, but we don't have documentation that really gives us what we need. So there are lots of collections that are beginning to emerge as people pass away and their families are left with them. And we definitely are looking for those so that we can give them a proper home, but so that they can be studied, because there's such important information in those collections. Most of the sites that are documented, though, for the South River watershed are in the Shenandoah-Lyndhurst area, where the Maple Flats ponds, where those sinkhole ponds are located. And then, of course, Port Republic and Grottos. And there's a reason for that. The area between Shenandoah and Lyndhurst is on National Forest land, and as a federal agency, they are required, whenever there's a timber sale or anything that is going to disturb the ground, they're required to do archaeology. And that's why there's so much that has been documented there. And then Port Republic, Grottos, James Madison University in the 1970s began to go out there and document archaeological sites. So one can only imagine what's in between. You sort of get the picture, I hope, tonight. So in summary, South River Watershed is topographically and ecologically unique. It holds great potential for learning about that culture, nature, interaction, that coming back together again, and it was absolutely central. The South River Watershed was central to Native American settlement in this part of the Shenandoah Valley. I do want to mention that the kinds of questions that I've raised this evening, because believe me, we have a lot more questions than we do answers, but these are the kinds of questions that will take long-term citizen-based efforts. And so the notion of there being a museum here where there are people who understand this material, who understand the importance of these stories, it is a tremendous gift. It's a tremendous gift not just to Waynesboro, but to the scientific world. It's a tremendous gift to Virginia's Native people as well. So I just want to end by mentioning that in the meantime, while we're waiting for the new museum to be built, we do have a new nonprofit, Mountain Valley Archaeology. We have a really nice restored building. It was an old gas station in Mount Crawford, Virginia on Route 11, so in far southern Rockingham County, almost to the Augusta County line. But as Joe was saying, our goal for this particular location is to open it up to citizen science and to open it up to community research and community work. And we've got connections, of course, to the local universities, so there will be students there as well, multi-generational. We like multi-generational. So you'll be hearing more about Mountain Valley Archaeology, and we hope that we might be able to get some of you to join us and do work. We've got a number of projects that are lined up, and just many, many people to thank, many organizations to thank. So thank you.
For Dr. Nash, if anyone would like to ask some?
Yes, ma'am.
In these mounds that have found arrowheads and artifacts like that, do they find any bones?
Oh, yes. The question is, were bones found in the mounds? What will happen today when you walk over the fields where the mounds once were, you will see broken up pieces of human remains. You'll see broken up pieces of bone. Every now and then you will be able to identify a tooth or something like that. But when, for example, the Lewis Creek Mound was excavated there were many, many human remains. A number of them are at the Smithsonian currently. We would like to see them repatriated to the Monacan people because this is part of their cultural heritage. But there also, interestingly enough, are really specific animal bones associated and different animals with different mounds. And we think this might indicate clan membership. So for example, with the Lewis Creek Mound, they're actually dogs. There are small dogs that were buried in the Lewis Creek Mound, but there were wolves, cougars, eagles, just a lot of animals that would have held important symbolic meaning. And then, of course, lots and lots of pottery, smoking pipes, all sorts of things like that. Every now and then, an object that came from far away. So, for example, you'll find a pendant of cannel coal that has come all the way from West Virginia, or you might see copper from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. But keep in mind that today, we don't do what archaeologists used to do. In order to excavate a burial today, you have to have a court order. And we are working hard to make sure that landowners understand that there are still people in these places and they need to be protected. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Just to follow up on that, were the mounds also populated by leaders of the tribes? Was there evidence of weapons or tools or jewelry being found associated with the bones of perhaps a chieftain?
Very good question. One of the things that is fascinating about these burial mounds, and it would have been true of the one here, is that they appear to have been very egalitarian. The individuals who are buried with the most grave goods are children. And they are buried with shell necklaces that come from the Gulf Coast, that come from the coast of Virginia and North Carolina. You will find very, very well-made arrowheads. You will find beautiful pottery and things of that sort, but mostly everyday items. And so one of the points that has been made is that it's almost as though there is this leveling in death that mirrors the egalitarianism and the sharing in life. And that, you know, just as we bury the dead in cemeteries and we're all together in rows, it was that sort of thing. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
We have time for one more question. Anyone like to ask?
I do have another.
Please follow up, yes.
Well, a different question.
Yes.
With regard to the agricultural question, given the fact that the valley was a crossroads, both because of the water course and the narrowness of the region,
Yes.
you pointed out,
Yes.
and because there had been agriculture going on elsewhere in the U.S., farm,
Right.
you know,
Right.
beans, squash.
Yes.
It's amazing that your evidence for agriculture here doesn't show until 1400, roughly 600 years ago.
Very late, very late, yes,
Very late.
yes.
Do you have any explanation?
That's
for
a
that?
great question as well. So what we find in the excavations of the archaeological sites is that their diet was absolutely still dominated by wild food.
Because the
Yeah.
abundance maybe.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting, different parts of Virginia got maize at different times and got different varieties of maize. So what shows up here in the Shenandoah Valley around AD 1350, 1400 is the Ohio Flint maize. Whereas if you're in southwestern Virginia, there's a maize that shows up there that originated in Tennessee. Maize is genetically plastic. What a crazy plant maize is. And within just a few generations, you can create your own variety. And that seemed to be something that was happening. There was a lot of scientific experimentation going on. But more to your point, one of the questions that we are often asked is, what was the population? Because the idea has been that if you're going to have maize agriculture, you're feeding large numbers of people, right? And exactly. And we see two things. First of all, we see very little evidence of damage in the dentition. So in other words, in parts of the world where maize becomes the basis of the diet, in parts of North America, you would not believe the cavities because the sugar in corn that sticks to the teeth, right? And we don't see that as much here. And that's an indication that maize was not as important. There are some archaeologists who have argued that maize was actually a prestige food. And that people were actually more experimenting with what we would consider to be wild plants, like amaranth, lamb's quarters, sunflower, gourd, that those may have been more important plant foods for them than maize. Yeah. It's definitely a different story. The assumption had always been that the native people here had been growing corn and, you know, the first farmers, but it was very late and very sparing. Yeah. You're welcome.
All right, it's already after 8 o'clock. I'm sure Dr. Nash will stick around to answer one-on-one questions, but please let's thank her one more time for a great talk.